Hey ghouls and gals, or should I say, hey constant readers, my name is Taylor and welcome back to my channel. Today's video is going to be a fun little, or maybe not quite so little, vlog where I am reading my way through Stephen King's Nightmares and Dreamscapes. Now, I have admittedly, unfortunately, not read a lot of Stephen King's short story collections. I am just, when it comes to my reading preferences, not a big short story person in general. However, Stephen King, one of my favorite authors, and this year he came out with You Like It Darker, and it's probably going to be in my top 10 books of the year because I absolutely loved it. And every time that I read a Stephen King short story collection, I am reminded that this guy just knows how to write short stories, and especially short format horror. So I figured, let's dive into Castle Rock. This is quite a tome. There are actually 24 stories in this collection, and it's long past due that I read this one. So that is what we are going to do for this vlog today. I am so excited to dive into this collection. I have heard such wonderful things. I'm really excited to dive into this one. I do not know a lot about this collection. Most of the collections, I feel like I go into them knowing a little bit about them just in terms of theme or well-known stories, like For Past Midnight and Different Seasons. Those are short story collections that I have read before, but before I even got into them, I kind of knew like what they were about or some major stories in them. I don't know pretty much anything about this collection, which is very exciting. So I'm going to go ahead and get to reading. I think I'll check in like every couple of stories. There are 24 in here, so each book is not, or each short story is not going to get its own update, but I'll probably, I don't know, update them in like groups of 3 or 4 depending like how long they are. But yeah, I'm really excited. Let's just dive into this one. Let's go ahead and get reading. Read the first 4 stories in Nightmares and Dreamscapes, or at least I've read 4 stories in this short story collection because I did pick up the audiobook because I wanted to listen to the audiobook while reading this physically. Also, Stephen King tends to, in the short story collections, have really great narrators with celebrity narrators and just really well-known narrators in the field. So I picked the audiobook up thinking that that would be a good idea, and it is for the most part. For whatever reason, the stories in the audiobook are not in the same order as the stories in the physical book. So at first that was a lot confusing. I'm not really sure why they did that, but that's just something to know. If you dive into the audiobook, it might be a little harder than you would imagine to follow along physically. But 4 stories in, and this is feeling like a very strong collection. So the first story that I read was Suffer the Little Children, and the audiobook is narrated by Whoopi Goldberg, and this is about a school teacher, and she is teaching her class per usual, but something happens in the class that makes her view her students a lot differently. This one was very short. I thought Whoopi Goldberg did a great job narrating this one. I think this is such like a classic Stephen King setup where it feels like a very mundane, ordinary day, and then it quickly devolves into madness. This one, again, very short. I think about 10 pages or so, but you know, the ending, very crazy, very wild and explosive. This one's a wild ride. At around only 10 pages or so, Miss Sidley's descent into maybe madness, or maybe finding something terrifying and unnerving about her group of students, was a very interesting listen. Again, the audiobook narration was great. I don't have a lot to say about this one, but I did think it was a good start to the collection of stories, even though it wasn't the one that was originally starting the collection. The second story that I read in this collection was Crouch End. This one's narrated by Tim Curry, and this one I absolutely loved, and I have to say, I think if I read it physically, this would not be one that I would have loved as much, but Tim Curry just does such an amazing job of really bringing this story to life, and I could listen to him narrate audiobooks all day long. He just did such a great job, and I loved hearing him come back for a Stephen King project. This follows 2 police officers, and they are investigating a woman's claim that her husband disappeared, but her her story sounds bizarre and one of them does not believe her, but then the other one starts talking to that police officer about the very strange happenings that can happen in Crouch End. One thing that I think the audiobook narration does really well is when you are following this woman's narration and her story and what happened, it starts off a very normal day and then things start getting a little bit creepier as she goes on throughout her day, and I think it's a lot easier to pick that up in the audiobook and really start to hear when things start going maybe a little bit awry and maybe she doesn't notice it or we the reader don't notice it quite as much. But the emphasis and the way that Tim Curry told this story I thought was really enjoyable, and again, I don't think I would have liked it as much had I not been listening to him narrate it, because cosmic stories, and this one doesn't go like full throttle cosmic necessarily, but cosmic stories are not my favorite subgenre of horror, but I did really like this one. And then next we moved on to Rainy Season, and this was an interesting experience for a number of reasons. First of all, it's narrated by Yeardley Smith, who plays Lisa Simpson in The Simpsons, and it turns out like that's just her voice. When this story started, I was so taken aback. I was like, is that who I think it is? And I looked it up and it was. So once you get past the strangeness of that, honestly, I do think it works for this story. We are following a couple and they are going to this very small Maine town for a sabbatical while the husband does some writing. The locals warn them off. They say it's the rainy season. They should turn around. They should not stay in this town. They should go back home. The couple, of course, ignores these warnings by the townspeople. They stay in the house and crazy things happen when the rainy season comes. This one is just, that's so Stephen King. It's such a silly concept on paper, but then when you actually read the story, you get very invested, and then by the end, you're like, oh, was I really that invested and a little bit unnerved by this concept that sounds silly, but he still manages to write it in such a compelling way. One of the characters mentions the lottery in this short story, and I would say it's a very similar premise almost, because you have that small town feeling where everything seems perfect and idyllic and something very strange and bizarre happens. The only difference is that the things that happen are to outsiders, not a member of the town. This was a very strange story. I did love the small town life that was depicted in the story. I think it's one of King's strengths, and blue chambray work shirt was spotted in this one. That's something that I'm always picking up in his books. So many characters wear the blue chambray work shirt, so it is spotted in this story. And then the last story that I ended up reading was Dolan's Cadillac, and this is actually the first story if you read it physically, but it's the fourth story in the audiobook. This one was narrated by Rob Lowe, and this one is my least favorite of the three so far. I think, you know, partially just because I'm not a big Rob Lowe fan. He did a good job narrating this audiobook, but I think I was just really spoiled by the audiobook narrators so far. So he did okay, but he wasn't my favorite. So this story is about a crime boss, Dolan, and he murders a woman who was supposed to testify against him. Our main character is the husband of the woman that Dolan murdered, and he spends 7 long years planning his revenge against Dolan. He wants to bring this guy to justice because Dolan killed his wife, and then there was no trial for any of Dolan's criminal activities nor for killing his wife. So our narrator spends 7 long years making a plan for retribution, for justice, and to bring Dolan down. So this was an enjoyable short story. I'm not saying just because it was my least favorite of the 4 that it was a bad story, but it's definitely one that I've read like the concepts of before. It feels a lot like Billy Summers or 11/22/63, where a large part of the plot is the main character building out an idea and so much resting on the successful completion of this idea and putting together all of the little pieces and parts and what exactly could go wrong and how high the stakes are. So I did enjoy this. It felt very classic King in terms of plot. I think he really likes having this man who, for all intents and purposes, should not be able to bring down a crime boss. He is a teacher, an elementary school teacher, and he should not be able to bring down this crime boss on his own, but he is going to try his hardest. And again, I enjoyed this one. It wasn't my favorite. I do feel like the short story, or not even short story, but even in novel format, King has done this before and done it better, but you know, I did enjoy it. So we are now 4 stories into this one. We have 20 more stories to go, which is just absolutely crazy. I'm about 20% of the way into the audiobook. Don't know where I am in the physical book because again, we are jumping all over the place, but this has been a pretty solid start to the short story collection so far. So I'm going to go read the next batch of short stories and I will check back in later with another reading update. Okay friends, so I have read another 4 short stories in Nightmares and Dreamscapes, and these last 4 were such an interesting arrangement. Definitely, I think thematically the most different because we had 2 short stories, a nonfiction, and a poem. The first short story in this group was The House on Maple Street, and this one was narrated by Tabitha King. I have to say, I do think this one is my favorite of the whole bunch. I don't know what it is about this story, but it really worked for me. We are following 4 siblings, and when they come home from vacation, they see that something has changed within their house. These 4 siblings not only have to try and figure out what is happening in their house because it's something a little bit strange, a little bit out of the ordinary, but they also have to try and figure out what to do about their parents because their mother is married to their stepfather, and it turns out throughout this short story, you see that not everything is as perfect as this family is trying to portray it to be. And I think one of the things that I loved about this one, first of all, is just the characters' voices were so clear, so distinct. The way that the siblings interacted with each other's felt so real and refreshing. I really liked that. I also think this is an example of a story that Stephen King does really well because you have very supernatural, paranormal, like uncanny, not everyday horror elements, but then you also have horror elements of relationships and things that can happen and do happen in real life, and the blending of those and using those as a pairing to kind of explore both concepts through the eyes of a child. I just thought this one did it so well. I did like the narration. I was not expecting Tabitha King to narrate one of these stories, and I do think she did a really good job. Again, overall, this collection, highly recommend the audiobook because the narration and the cast of narrators is so strong for this collection. I've really been having a great time listening to this via audiobook. So if you are on the fence and if you don't like, because I do often read physically and audio like kind of interchangeably back and forth or at the same time, so if you only like one or the other, I would kind of recommend the audiobook honestly because it has been such a great experience. But this one was really great. It just combines a lot of things that I love about Stephen King. His little kid characters really shine here. I love the sibling dynamics, and again, I just love that paranormal mixed with a little slice of reality. The next story in this batch of stories was Umney's Last Case. This was narrated by Robert B. Parker, who is a crime writer. Now this one, I am not a huge fan of like detective noir fiction, so when I first dived into this one, I do think also because I had loved The House on Maple Street so much that I was very hesitant about getting to this one. It took me a little bit to really warm up to what we're listening to because we are following a man named Umney. He's a PI and he lives in, I think, San Francisco in the 1930s or late 30s, almost to the 40s. So that's a hard sell for me. My least favorite Stephen Kings tend to be like the hard case crimes and like the noir detective sort of fiction books. So I was nervous going into this one, and I'm glad that I stuck through because the ending did turn out to be not what I expected. So if you are like me and you don't love like noir fiction, and it reads very much like pulp noir fiction at the beginning, so it is like a little bit jarring. I think Stephen King does a great job of kind of disguising a lot of his voice at the beginning and making it sound like a Maltese Falcon type of book, and then, you know, there's like a King twist and it starts getting more like Stephen King. And I do like the way that this book ended up. It's not one of my favorites in the collection just because I don't really love a noir mystery or following a PI. So I was very pleasantly surprised by Umney's Last Case, and that leads us into another story that I was very pleasantly surprised surprised by, and that would be Head Down. This one is actually narrated by Stephen King himself, and only King could make me like this and could make me enjoy this. This is a nonfiction essay about his son Owen's team and their journey, for lack of a better word, from a normal season into winning a championship. So it is a lot about baseball, and you know, I'm not so much a nonfiction person. I was a little hesitant going in, realizing that it was such a long nonfiction essay and then a nonfiction essay about Little League baseball. Like, that is not something that I would seek out on my own ever, but I think this really kind of cements the fact that I've joked about before, that I would read whatever King puts out. Like, I would even read his grocery list, and this really put me to the test on that, and I did end up reading, and I ended up really liking this one. It's not one of my favorites of the collection. It's nonfiction. It's got no horror elements. Don't go into it expecting that, but it is very sweet. It's very sweet. It's very touching. It's reminiscing about just the beauty of Little League baseball, and it's nostalgia and just the pure love of the game that Stephen King has on every single page of this essay. I think this could be a hit for a lot of people. I think if you are a parent, or like if you've ever had to do the whole Little League or travel team or taking kids to tournaments for any kind of sport, I think this could ring true for you and maybe bring up some nostalgic memories. If you also, on the other hand, were a kid who especially played baseball or played sports as a child and maybe don't anymore, I think King really captures a sense of nostalgia. And this is another one, I know I joked that I would read his grocery list. This is not as boring as reading a grocery list. For me, I like reading something that is clear that people are so passionate about. I think it's the same thing when talking to other people. Like, someone could have a passion, like knitting, for example. I don't care about knitting, but if someone loves knitting and is so passionate about knitting and wants to talk about knitting with me, I think that's a fascinating conversation, because I love hearing people talk about things that they love. There's just something special about listening to people gush about their interests. I love that. Stephen King loves baseball, and you can tell in this nonfiction essay. So I did have a good time reading this one. Very nostalgic. Even though I am not a huge baseball person, I did appreciate what he was doing in this one, and I do like that he did include it in this selection of stories. And I will say, this one and the next one, they were originally the last two stories, I believe, in the collection, or at least based on my bookmark, they're getting close to the last stories in the collection. And I am glad that I read them towards the middle of the collection and not at the end, because, you know, they are a short story, I guess, or a short story nonfiction about baseball, and then the next one is a poem. So I'm glad that these were kind of sprinkled in the middle and not at the very end of the collection. This leads me to the last thing that I read, and that was Brooklyn August. This is narrated by Stephen J. Gould, and it is a poem about baseball. I'm not a poetry person, and that's okay. Different strokes for different folks. And when I would seek out a poetry, I don't think I'd necessarily seek out Stephen King poetry. I'd maybe seek out someone who actually like writes poetry for a living. I don't know. This was fine. It is very short, and I think if it would have been longer than like a page and a half, I wouldn't have enjoyed it. It was fine for what it was. I'm not a poetry person. It's definitely going to be the most forgettable of this collection for me, but that is okay. I think for the rest of this book, they all should be short stories and they should be fiction. So I am excited to read the next 4 short stories in this collection. I'm gonna go get to reading those, and I will check back in later with another update. So I have finished the next 4 short stories in this collection, and we are back to short story fiction. There's no nonfiction or poems in this group of 4, and overall they were pretty solid reads. None of them ended up being like my new favorite of the collection, but a good solid number of stories here. So the first story in this set of 4 was Chattery Teeth by Kathy Bates, and this one is following a traveling salesman. He stops by the side of the road to get some gas at this gas station. It's also kind of like a curio shop. They say that they're like a roadside zoo, roadside attraction, and he happens to find this pair of chattery teeth. I don't know how else to describe it other than the fact it's like a very kitschy toy that I feel like most people have seen before. It's just a pair of teeth. They kind of look almost like dentures, but like with gums attached to them, and they have little feet on the end, and they just like, you know, chatter. The salesman sees these teeth, think it's a perfect gift for his son, so he gets these teeth. This salesman is about to take off when a young hitchhiker asks if he can hitch a ride. The salesman agrees, and the story kicks off from there. This one, again, narrated by Kathy Bates. I had a really great time. She has a really great voice for this story, just with the different characters, because there's not a lot of different characters in this one. You mainly get our main character, the traveling salesman, and then you also get the hitchhiker, and then the mom and pop of the mom and pop curio gas station that give him these chattery teeth, and she did a really good job with that. I think the best part of this story for me was just that small slice of small suburban American life. I really enjoyed that. I thought this story was enjoyable, not my favorite, not my least favorite, very middle of the road, very like Stephen King. I don't know how to explain that. Like, if I were to read this story not having known that Stephen King wrote it, I would definitely be able to pinpoint that Stephen King wrote this story, just with the way that everything kind of comes together and it's all centering these chattery teeth. The next story is titled My Pretty Pony, and it's narrated by Jerry Garcia, and this one definitely feels a little bit out of place with a lot of the collection, because a lot of these stories are really focusing on the horror and the sci-fi of it all. This one is very much just like a slice of life. It's a conversation between a grandfather and his grandson, and he explains what a pretty pony is and how time seems to change throughout one's life. How when you're young, time goes by really slowly, and then towards the end, it really speeds up. So talking about the nature of time, this one is absolutely beautiful writing. It's something that King does really well. However, I do like it when it is within a larger story, because you have those sentimental moments, those slice of life moments, those very real feeling conversations and characters. But just on its own, this one didn't do too much for me. There was definitely a stretch of time, I think it was about a page or so, where the grandson is thinking about summer days and how summer seems endless when you're a child, and that was absolutely beautiful. It actually reminded me a lot of It when the kids are getting out from school. But Ben reminisces as he's walking to the library about how you get out of school as a kid and you feel like summer is endless and it's stretching out before you in this endless, beautiful stretch of time where you can do whatever you want and time is your own. Like, that really reminded me, like, these two conversations in My Pretty Pony and then in It, they really mirror each other. However, that was all that this story gave. So it was very beautiful. The writing was beautiful, and it was a really great conversation. It feels like a real conversation. However, just because that's all that it was, is a singular conversation, it's not my favorite of the short stories. No, going into this one, that it's not going to be like thriller or horror. There are really no speculative elements in this one. It's just a very nostalgic, sentimental story. So it was okay, beautiful writing, just it wasn't my favorite. The next story that I read is Sneakers, and this one was narrated by David Cronenberg, and this is about a man who works in New York City. He works in the music industry, and he works in this very tall building, a lot of floors. He goes to the 3rd floor bathroom to use the bathroom every single day, and one day he notices that there's a pair of sneakers in the stall next to him. He doesn't really think anything of it at first, because obviously there are going to be other people using the bathroom, but he starts to notice every time he goes into the bathroom, the sneakers are still there in the same exact stall, and flies and different hints of decay are starting to infiltrate the stall, and he can't help but wonder what is in the stall. Is it a dead body? Is it a ghost? Now, this one I think had one of the most promising setups. This one had one of the most interesting setups, and unfortunately, I just feel like this one didn't really hit the mark with the landing. I thought it was so intriguing. I liked this very clearly paranormal story that has to deal with ghosts, and the imagery quite creepy, because if you just imagine yourself like in a very vulnerable situation, you're in public, but you're in a very private, secluded place in public, and you think you're alone, but you maybe are not alone. That's very creepy. I didn't love the way that this one ended up though, so I do think some of the potential of the story wasn't fully realized, which is why it wasn't one of my favorites, which is a little frustrating, because at the beginning I was like, this could be one of the creepiest stories in this collection, and then it kind of fizzled out towards the end. But overall, it was a decent story. And then the last short story that I read in this batch of 4 is Dedication. This one is narrated by Lindsay Krause, who is the person that I had the least name recognition for. When I looked her up though, she's actually narrated a bunch of other Stephen King audiobooks as well, including Misery and Gerald's Game. And she is a really great audiobook narrator. I thought this story was one of the most well-told stories in terms of audiobook narration. I feel like some of the other bigger names, I'm not gonna single anyone out. I think if you listen to it, and of course, listening to things and the things that we prefer in listening to audiobooks is going to vary person by person, but some people who maybe don't narrate audiobooks for a living or have never narrated an audiobook, sometimes you can tell, for lack of a better word. I think the biggest thing is pacing. People who have read a lot of audiobooks or narrated a lot of audiobooks, they know how to get that pacing down more, and I've noticed that for some of the narrators in this collection, I've had to kind of speed up or slow down my audiobook listening speed just based on their narration pace. But this one was really excellently told, and this one, honestly, I almost think like if it were any other author, they could have turned this one into a full-length story or even like a novelette, because it was very intriguing. We are following our main character, and she is a maid, and her son writes a novel, publishes it, sends it to her. Martha, the main character, is so pleased and proud of her son, and she shows off this dedication to one of her friends. But that leads the two women into a conversation about how this was not unexpected for Martha's son, because she always knew that he was destined for greatness. And it's not like moms wishing the best for their children. She actually knew in a supernatural way that this would happen, and she tells the story to her friend. This one's a little bit of a weird one at points, not saying that like other stories in this collection aren't. I mean, we've had like Raining Frogs and Chattery Teeth, but it's really interesting. It's a little bit witchcraft adjacent. I don't want to say too much more because I do really like the way that this short story is formatted, where our main character is telling a story to her friend. And so of course what that means, it's like she's actually telling a story to you, and I just think King is a master at this style of narration. Dolores Claiborne is one of my favorite stories by him, especially in audiobook format, and I think that that's partially why, is because of that format where it feels like a character is just sitting down and telling you a story. I don't really know how I feel about this one. Like I said, on a technical level, this is probably one of the better stories, but on like a personal enjoyment level, I didn't really know like what the point of a lot of it was, which is why I mentioned I feel like this could have been like a full-length novel, because you're getting all of this information and you think maybe, I don't know, there's a lot of weird things that go on in this one, and then it just ends, and I feel like it either could have been a whole lot shorter or a whole lot longer. I think this is about 60 or 70 pages, and yeah, I don't really know what I'm trying to say. I thought the concept was interesting, but also kind of like Sneakers, I suppose. The execution and the ending didn't really fully live up to my enjoyment of the beginning of these stories, so yeah. I am now officially 50% of the way through Nightmares and Dreamscapes, and I am rapidly losing my light, so I am going to end out this clip. I'm going to go read another 4 short stories, and I will check back in later with another reading update. So this is a little bit of a change of scenery. It also might be a little bit of a change in hair color. I am not too sure what my hair color situation was the last vlog update, but I am at my parents' house visiting, but I do have a Nightmares and Dreamscapes update. I read another 4 short stories in this collection, so let's just go ahead and talk about them. The first short story I'm going to talk about today is The Doctor's Case. This one was narrated by Tim Curry. This one, again, had a wonderful narration. That was the saving grace for me in this story, actually. It was a Sherlock Holmes case. Watson is narrating a case where he actually solves the mystery before Sherlock Holmes, and I am just not a Sherlock Holmes person. I said this before with Umney's Last Case. I am just not a fan of like traditional detective stories, whether that be Umney's Last Case was in the 1950s, I believe. I can't remember. It's been a while since I've read that one, but I think it was actually in the 40s, 1940s detective fiction. This one was set in Sherlock Holmes time. This one was okay. It just is not the type of story that I enjoy, but I will say the Tim Curry narration was top tier. So nothing much more to say about that one. Maybe if you are a fan of Sherlock Holmes in particular, you would like this take on Sherlock Holmes, but I'm not a fan, so this one was just okay for me. The next story is The Moving Finger. This is narrated by Eve Belgarian. This short story is about a man who goes to the bathroom bathroom in his apartment one day and he sees just one singular finger sticking out of his sink drain. That is a very creepy image. However, I felt like this one was a little bit like Sneakers, and I know that this is like a common critique of King as a whole, but this one just did not really stick the landing for me. The first initial sighting of the finger was very creepy. I wanted to know where this story was going to go, and it didn't do much for me by the end. Some creepy visuals, and it wrapped up and it concluded pretty definitively, but I don't know how much I loved the journey. I feel like maybe this short story could have been a whole lot shorter, and I know that's very hard for King. I know his short stories are a lot longer than a lot of other people's short stories, but this one could have just been maybe a couple of pages to really keep that creepy tension, maybe like a one-shot scene, because the initial introduction of the finger in the drain, that's creepy. I just didn't love where this one went. The moving finger ultimately was just okay, if not just a little disappointing with how it wrapped up, but we're moving on to the next story, and that would be the end of the whole mess. This one is narrated by Matthew Broderick. This was a surprising tale for me for a number of reasons. Number one, Matthew Broderick did a really great job, especially in this one. Towards the end of this story, I think that the audiobook really focuses and really like pinpoints the eeriness and the creepiness of the ending, because you are hearing someone, not to give anything away, but when you listen to the story, or if you've read this story, then you'll understand like the narration choices, and just hearing someone speak, the ending works like really well for this one, and Matthew Broderick did a great job. But this story is about the end of the world, and the narrator is actually the brother of the man who essentially caused the end of the world, and he has a very finite amount of time left, and he is describing the events that led to the end of the whole mess. And this one, you know, it's okay. This short story collection has no theme whatsoever. I would not recommend this one to first-time King readers, I don't think, just because there's no theme. Like, you have it all. You have nonfiction, you have poetry, you have crime, you have paranormal, you have horror, and you have like apocalyptic fiction as well. I think this collection is going to be for people who have already read from King and just like his storytelling voice. This one was an enjoyable story overall, and I really did feel like the audiobook narration really impacted the ending of this one in a positive way. And then the last story that I read in this bunch was Home Delivery. This one is narrated by Stephen King, and this is about a very small island, a woman who is pregnant on this small island, and she is preparing for a home delivery, which was already going to be hard because she has just recently lost her husband in a tragic fishing accident. However, her home delivery is going to be a lot more hard because zombies. This one is also a post-apocalyptic tale. I did like how quiet and isolated this one was, because the community in which our main character lives is very cut off from the rest of the world, which is actually very beneficial for a zombie outbreak, because they only have the one cemetery and they don't have a lot of access for people from the mainland to come to the island. So it's a very interesting setup for a zombie tale. Honestly, this one I felt like could have been like a novelette or a story on its own, but I did like this short story. I love when Stephen King narrates his own work. I do think he has like a really great narration, especially for small town Maine life. I like when we get King reading a story, especially I just love his little tiny small town slice of life stories, and then you add something horrific on top of it. So in terms of like zombie fiction, I'm not the biggest zombie person, but I thought the balance of this one between like the horror is the zombies, or the horror is just like the end of the world and preparing for new experiences with zombies just, you know, being a part of that. I thought the balance of that was really well. This one was probably my favorite out of all four of these stories for this reading update. So yeah, really enjoyed it. This update is bringing us to the 70% mark of this book. This book is an absolute whopper. It's a tome. I have a feeling this video is going to be fairly lengthy as well. So that is going to be the end of this update. I'm gonna go read some more short stories, and I will check back in later with another update. So it has been quite some time since my last update. The audiobook ended up being returned to the library. I had to get back on hold for it, and then in the meantime Halloween happened, Thanksgiving happened as well, and it's been a minute, but I did read 5 more stories in this collection, and honestly some of my favorites were within this section. I am really excited to talk about these, even though I feel a little rusty because it has been a minute since I've updated this vlog. But the first story that I read in this bundle of stories was It Grows on You. Now, this one is narrated by Stephen King himself. It takes place in Castle Rock, and it's about a group of people at a store, and they are gossiping about a man and his house. And this one, you know, I love how Stephen King writes dialogue. This feels like you pressed play on a tape recorder and recorded some people like in a small mom and pop shop in a small town. Like, the people sound real, they feel real. However, I didn't get a lot out of this one because it was just a conversation. Now maybe I'm missing something because I have not read everything that has to deal with Castle Rock, so maybe I'm missing some connections. Let me know down below if this connects to anything else other than just being in Castle Rock. But this one, I guess I enjoyed the ride. Stephen King narrates it, but just it didn't go anywhere. The next short story was The Fifth Quarter. This is narrated by Gary Sinise, and this is probably one of my least favorite stories in the collection. It is about a job that goes horribly wrong, or rather a deal to get paid for a job, like a criminal job that goes horribly wrong, and I just didn't love this one. However, thankfully it was quite short, so I didn't have to spend too much time with it, but this one was definitely just one of the weaker ones for me. And then moving on to a more positive light, the next 3 short stories are probably my favorite 3 in the collection, or some of my favorites as well, because there have been a lot of short stories in this collection. I'm going to have to kind of go through all of them again and think about which ones are going to be my favorites for the conclusion of this vlog. That's neither here nor there. The next story I read was You Know They've Got a Hell of a Band. This one was narrated by Grace Slick, and this is about a couple who are going on a road trip. They take a wrong turn and they end up at this very strange little town. Now, this one is actually the only one that I would probably recommend you reading physically as opposed to audio. Grace Slick did an amazing job. She's a great narrator without giving too much away, though. There are some very distinctive voices that are in this one that are really hard for anyone to do. Again, without giving too much away, I would almost say this one should have been narrated by someone at SNL maybe, or someone who does impressions, just because a lot of this book hinges on some interesting characters, and that's all I'll say. I really liked this one. This one felt very Twilight Zone-y. It was equal parts creepy and just fun to read, and I really had a great time with this one. I thought it was a lot of fun. Moving on, the next short story that I read was The Night Flier. This one was narrated by Frank Mueller, and this is definitely a voice that I have heard before. I believe he does a whole bunch of audiobooks because his voice sounded so familiar. But this is about a tabloid reporter, and he gets a hunch that there is someone who is killing people alongside the east coast of the United States, all the way up and down the coast. This person thinks that they are a vampire based on how the bodies are left, and he goes on the hunt for this vampire that may or may not be a serial killer who thinks he's a vampire, or potentially the real thing. This one as well, I really enjoyed it. The audiobook production was really great. I really love vampire fiction, so seeing Stephen King enter the world of vampires again, even if it was just for a very short story, I just had a lot of fun with this one. I felt like even though it was short, you really got a sense for who our main character was and the antagonist, and just a little bit of a murder mystery following the trail of something evil. I really enjoyed it. And then last but not least for this section, I read Popsy. This one is narrated by Joe Mantegna, who I know and love from Criminal Minds. So when this one started playing, I was like, oh my gosh, that's Rossi. So that was a delightful surprise, and I did enjoy this one. I was hesitant at first because this is following a child abduction, but we are following the person who is abducting the child. So that's a very dark concept. It's a really hard sell to get invested in, but I was like, you know what? It's short. Joe Mantegna is narrating it and Stephen King's writing it. I think I'm going to be in good hands, and as I was reading, it definitely turned out to be the case. I really liked this one. I liked the way that it ended. I thought it ended in such a fun way, and I know reading about child abductions, that's like a hard thing, and that's why I was hesitant at the beginning of this short story, and I know why maybe a lot of people would also be hesitant. I will say this is about a child abduction, but a child abduction that does not go the way that the abductor planned it. So if you were hesitant on reading it, I still think that you can read it and enjoy it. And I think the ending has a really great and I don't know, can I say fun payoff? I don't know. This story worked for me, and I had a lot of fun. By the end, by the very last page, I really was invested with the story and really enjoyed the reveal. So overall, I had a lot of fun with these 5 short stories. I only have 4 more in the collection, so I'm going to go get to reading those, and I will check back in later with another reading update and to wrap up this vlog. So I finally finished Nightmares and Dreamscapes by Stephen King. I only have 3 short stories to talk about because I accidentally included the author's notes like in my count. So the last 3 stories were a little bit of a mixed bag, if we're being honest. My favorite of those had to be Sorry, Right Number. This one was narrated by a full cast. This one, Stephen King talks about it in the note section. He wrote it to be like adapted for screen or a teleplay, something like that. And actually what is written in the book is different than what is in the audiobook because the audiobook is the final production. So I couldn't read along with this one, but I would say for this story alone, I would recommend picking up the audiobook because I just thought that there were some emotional beats that really hit and really made this work for me that I do not think I would have gotten had I read it physically. The voice acting here was amazing. This short story is why I love audiobooks, and this ended up being like a really solid story in the collection. We are following a typical suburban family. The mother gets a very strange and mysterious call, someone screaming, begging for help. She feels like she recognizes the voice and she has to figure out who it is. I just thought this one was really well done. The next story was The 10 O'Clock People. This one was narrated by Joe Morton. This is about a man who goes on his normal mid-morning smoke break and sees something horrific, and before he can react, someone else, another one of the smokers on a smoke break, pulls him aside and brings him into this sort of conspiracy, and he realizes things may not be what most of the world can see. This one was just okay. I almost feel like if I would have read this one at the beginning of this collection, I would have enjoyed it more. However, there were other stories in here that I thought did a better job of combining normal everyday things with paranormal or out of this world horrors. This one also made some really bizarre comparisons to people who are smokers being as discriminated against as Black people during the segregation era, which was a choice. That was weird. There was like a lot of commentary about smokers and smoking and the ways in which we divide our society, which I understand why it ties into this short story, but just felt a little bit weird and a little bit out of place. It ended up being okay. Not my favorite, not my least favorite. And then we actually have a story that in the audiobook, we had the author's notes, and then we had this short story, which was a little bit weird of a place to put it, but that would be The Beggar and the Diamond. This is an adaptation of a Hindu parable, and it's very short, and it was fine. Didn't do anything for me necessarily, but it was really short, really readable. I don't understand why it was after the author's notes, because I just thought this book was done. And it's not in my physical copy. I think it was just on the audiobook. I don't know. It was fine for what it was, but I didn't really love it. But that is the end of this short story collection, an absolutely massive tome. And overall, I had a lot of fun reading it. Obviously, there were some stories that I didn't exactly love or didn't enjoy, but there were a lot of wins in this collection for me as well. Primarily, my favorites have to be The House on Maple Street. I really loved that one. And then I also really loved a lot of the short stories in the end of this collection, or rather the end of the audiobook. I loved, you know, They've Got a Hell of a Band, The Night Flier, Popsy, and honestly, even Sorry Right Number, I really enjoyed as well. I really like a production that has multiple audiobook narrators that really brings a story to life for me. So I enjoyed this collection overall. It was definitely one of the most intimidating books on my physical TBR, just because short stories are not something I typically gravitate towards first. I tend to like to read full-length novels more, but I had a fun time with this one. So definitely let me know down below, what short story collection of Stephen King's should I pick up next? I'm thinking it might be time to tackle something iconic like Night Shift. But thank you all so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please give it a thumbs up, leave a comment down below, subscribe to my channel for all of the bookish, horror, and cozy gaming content. Stay safe, stay spooky, and I will see y'all in the next video. Bye!